In May 1975, Hannah Arendt delivered the speech Home to Roost, a bicentennial address at the Bicentennial Forum held in Boston. The full text was published in the June 26, 1975 issue of the New York Review of Books. The speech attracted considerable attention for its unusually somber and profound tone. Unlike the blind optimism or doctrinaire reflections on the American system prevalent in mainstream academia at the time, Arendt offered a sharp critique of America's image politics and systematic lying, which was highly provocative then. At the time, her prognosis for America's future was considered overly pessimistic. Today, however, one can only marvel at how prophetic her warnings from 50 years ago have proven to be. In fact, shortly after arriving in the United States, Arendt began writing critical essays about the country. Reading these pieces today fills one with both admiration for her foresight and a deep sense of unease. Luo Siling Arendt's Foresight and Lament for America 50 years ago, also on Professor Moyn's one-sided quotation and misreading of Arendt. On June 30, Yale professor Samuel Moyn published the article, How America Went Awry, in Unheard. In it, Prof. Moyn argues that over the past decade, faced with political shocks such as Trump's election, many resistance liberals have elevated Hannah Arendt to the status of a prophet. They have weaponized her theory of totalitarianism to explain the current crisis, claiming that today's world is in precisely the kind of crisis Arendt would have recognized. However, Professor Moyn contends that this is often posterity projecting its own fears onto Arendt. In reality, Arendt lacks sufficient foresight regarding the flaws in America's own system and its subsequent evolution. Professor Moyn believes Arendt had a blind spot about the essence of America. She never did glimpse the possibility that America itself had been, or could indeed become, an empire. She mistakenly diagnosed crises such as the Vietnam War and Watergate as mere temporary aberrations that deviated from the founding ideals, and she prescribed a remedy rooted in a nostalgic worship of the 1776 founding myth. Professor Moyn emphasizes that it is precisely the global hegemony and militaristic expansion pursued jointly by both American parties over the past 50 years that abandoned the domestic underclass and ultimately gave rise to Trumpism. He criticizes contemporary liberals for falling, like Arendt, into blind worship, using the false proposition of returning to normalcy, to evade reality and refusing to acknowledge that the current democratic crisis is the inevitable price of America's long-term maintenance of its imperial system. I do not deny that if resistance liberals use Arendt's The Origins of Totalitarianism as a weapon against Trump and hope to restore the pre-Trump American political normalcy through a Biden-style or mainstream democratic approach, this is indeed a misreading of Arendt, and a misjudgment of America's own problems. At the same time, however, I believe Professor Moyn's understanding of Arendt is equally one-sided and constitutes a serious misreading. In fact, Arendt issued early warnings about many of America's problems and crises, and her Bicentennial Address Home to Roost, a bicentennial address stands as her final lament for America. Professor Moyn's one-sided reading of Arendt. Professor Moyn's article primarily relies on Arendt's 1975 Bicentennial Address Home to Roost. A bicentennial address, supplemented by limited quotations from The Origins of Totalitarianism and On Revolution, to reach the conclusion that Arendt was blind to contemporary America. Yet he makes no mention of the many other important essays Arendt wrote specifically about the United States. In reality, from the 1940s to the 1970s, Arendt, describing herself as a European immigrant and outsider, produced at least a dozen commentary pieces on American current affairs. These are mainly collected in Between Past and Future, 1961-1968, and Crises of the Republic, 1972. Therefore, in my view, both the resistance liberals and Professor Samuel offer one-sided interpretations of Arendt. First, Professor Moyn claims that Arendt failed to foresee the global hegemony and militaristic expansion pursued jointly by both American parties. The truth is exactly the opposite. As early as 1954, in the early years of the Cold War, Arendt warned of America's imperialist tendencies, in her essay Dream and Nightmare. In 1971, in Lying in Politics, Reflections on the Pentagon Papers, she explicitly pointed out that America is a republic at home but an empire abroad, and that imperial expansion is structurally incompatible with republican constitutionalism. This overseas expansion and covert operations were irreversibly poisoning the foundations of the republic. She sharply warned that if America chose to become an overseas empire, it would have to rely on systematic lying, driven by interests and image, to rule, as exemplified by McNamara's Pentagon Papers. This would inevitably destroy the rule of law at home. This was not an accidental, wrong turn, but the inherent incompatibility between republic and empire. Professor Moyn not only ignores Arendt's warnings and diagnosis of the republic's crisis, but fundamentally misreads her intention. Even in the very speech Home to Roost on which Professor Moyn bases his argument, Arendt describes the failure in Vietnam and the Watergate scandal as a disarray of the republic's foundations, directly attributing them to the boomerang effect of imperialist foreign policy. Professor Moyn's assertion that she was completely unaware of the American empire is clearly unfair. The reason Arendt was so vigilant against imperialism is precisely and profoundly explained in the origins of totalitarianism. Arendt argued that the transformation from nation-state to totalitarian state must pass through the intermediate stage of imperialism. The nation-state is based on legal equality and civil rights, whereas late 19th century imperialism operated on the principle of unlimited expansion, shattering national boundaries and legal constraints. It gave rise to race thinking, bureaucratic rule, and the concept of superfluous populations, treating the conquered as objects to be disposed of at will. This logic of expansion destroyed the stable structure of the nation-state and cleared the path for totalitarianism. Totalitarian regimes simply brought the methods of imperial rule overseas, terror, propaganda, and ideology, back to the European homeland, ultimately devouring Europe's civilized order. In Arendt's view, although imperialism is not itself totalitarianism, it is indeed the historical precondition and bridge to totalitarianism. It was precisely because of this historical lesson that she remained highly vigilant and continually warned America against repeating the mistakes of imperialism. Even in Home to Roost, the very text Professor Moyn relies upon, Arendt offered a detailed analysis of America's economic ills at the time. She pointed out that although the New Deal is often regarded as a success story, purely economic data, such as unemployment rates and industrial production indices, show that it had not fundamentally resolved the Great Depression by the late 1930s. What truly pulled America out of the economic quagmire was not the New Deal itself, but the wartime economy forcibly implemented after the outbreak of World War II, that is, the massive military expansion that absorbed vast numbers of unemployed people. For this reason, she specifically praised the economist Seymour Melman and his book The Permanent War Economy, American Capitalism in Decline, 1974. Melman argued that since World War II, the United States had developed a permanent war economy. He contended that excessive military spending ruthlessly diverted large quantities of technical talent, R&D funds, and productive resources away from the civilian sector, the so-called Pentagon capitalism, severely weakening the competitiveness and innovative capacity of American civilian industries, such as steel, machine tools, and electronics. This, he argued, was the underlying cause of America's long-term economic decline and lagging infrastructure. Secondly, Professor Moyn also argues that the alternative facts of the Trump era were something Arendt could not have anticipated. Once again, the opposite is true. The relationship between lying in politics, truth, and politics itself was one of the central themes of Arendt's late thinking. In essays such as Truth and Politics, 1967, Lying in Politics, 1971. And Washington's Problem Solvers, 1972, Arendt provided a profound analysis of the nature, mechanisms, and consequences of political lying. Arendt pointed out that lying is not an accidental flaw in politics, but is rooted in the human capacity for imagination and action. Humans have the ability to deny facts and fabricate possibilities in order to change the world. The factual truth is extremely fragile. It depends heavily on witnesses and public speech. Once subjected to systematic deception, it is easily defactualized. political power frequently replaces reality with image-making and public relations logic. Lies, which may appear to serve higher goals or national image, in fact create a vicious cycle of self-deception. In the case of Vietnam War decision-making, Arendt revealed how the problem solvers filtered reality through abstract models, probability calculations, and ideology. Instead of judging facts, they constructed self-consistent solutions and prioritized the preservation of America's false image as the world's strongest power. This led to the comprehensive distortion of intelligence, battlefield reports, and policy. Such deception eventually shifted from being aimed at the public to becoming the self-deception of the decision-makers themselves, creating a credibility gap and a complete disconnect from reality. Arendt warned that organized lying is different from traditional political deception. It erodes the foundations of the common world. When people are forced to ignore the boundary between truth and falsehood in order to survive, truth disappears entirely from the public realm, and political action loses its stable anchor. Although lies may succeed temporarily, they cannot ultimately prevail over reality. They will inevitably lead to catastrophic policy failures and the total collapse of trust. These analyses directly address the dangers of modern alternative facts and underscore that defending factual truth is fundamental to maintaining a political community. Finally, Professor Moyn completely misunderstands Arendt's political intention in calling for a return to the founding spirit. In Arendt's political philosophy, the most important legacy of 1776 was not a great nation, but the power of citizens to act together and resist tyranny, as well as the constitutional consensus. As early as 1960, in her essay Revolution and Public Happiness, Arendt reinterpreted the American Revolution. She criticized modern America for deviating from the public happiness and constitutional consensus of the founding era, drifting instead toward consumerism and bureaucratization. A decade later, in 1970, she wrote Reflections on Civil Disobedience, clearly stating that when faced with government lies and imperial atrocities, such as the Vietnam War, the only legitimate resource for citizens' resistance was to return to the founding tradition of association and resistance. Her call to return to the beginning stemmed from her belief that America was already facing a serious crisis of the Republic. Crises of the Republic, 1972, another of her well-known collections of American commentaries, contains 4 interconnected essays: Lying in Politics, Reflections on Civil Disobedience, on Violence, 1969. And the interview form Thoughts on Politics and Revolution, 1971. These works were written in the late 1960s and early 1970s, precisely when America was deeply embroiled in the Vietnam War, the Civil Rights Movement, student protests, and widespread social turmoil. From the perspective of a political philosopher, Arendt viewed these contemporary crises as fundamental challenges to the core principles of the Republican system. She used them to reflect on the nature of power, lying, truth, action, and violence, and to diagnose the deeper causes confronting the modern republic. At the same time, she offered a remedy, through the restoration of genuine public action, the defense of factual truth, and the assumption of civic responsibility. The Republican spirit could still be reborn. The crises of America that Arendt identified more than 50 years ago have not become outdated. On the contrary, they are even more evident today.